A global recession is coming and you need to be prepared. If you pay any sort of attention to global financial news, you'll no doubt have heard lots of talk about recessions lately. Nomura, who are a global financial services organization, believe that a recession in the United States by the end of 2022 is more likely to happen than not. But not only that, they expect to see recessions throughout Europe, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Canada in 2023. Seemingly, we're on the brink of a global recession, and that's a scary thought. We know that the majority of US consumers are not only worried about a recession, but also rising inflation, which is having an impact on our standard of living. Add in the complexity of rising interest rates and the different stances taken by different countries, and all of a sudden, you'll find yourself with a headache. Despite all of this sounding very gloom and doom, the most important thing is to not panic. There are very simple and actionable steps that you can take to make sure that you're prepared for a recession, and we're going to discuss them right now. Number one, avoid debt. Avoiding debt at any point in time is typically advisable, but this is especially true given the current interest rate environment. 4 out of 5 of the last recessions in the US have been preceded by a period of time where interest rates have actively been increasing, which is exactly why there's cause for concern. The US Federal Reserve has increased interest rates in the US to a target rate of between 1.5 and 1.75%. What that means is that the federal funds effective rate has increased, and that can clearly be seen from the contrast in rates between February 2022 and where we're at today. The federal funds effective rate is essentially the rate at which banks in the US lend money to one another. The higher this rate goes, the more expensive it becomes for the likes of you and me to borrow money. You can see that the cost of credit card debt in the United States has started to increase across the board. And again, that's in response to the Federal Reserve's decision to increase interest rates. But this isn't just unique to the US. Interest rate increases have been seen in the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Norway, Australia, Sweden, and while the European Central Bank has yet to increase interest rates in the Eurozone, they are set to do so in July, with further increases planned for the rest of the year, meaning virtually everywhere globally, it's going to become more expensive to borrow money. The last thing you want in a recession is the burden of higher monthly interest payments, especially if you have other outgoings like rental costs or mortgage payments to cover. And we know that mortgages have inevitably started to become more expensive themselves. So minimizing the amount of unnecessary personal debt that you're taking on is critically important. Number two, be prepared for higher unemployment. Recessions are characterized by unemployment. In fact, historically, we can see a clear correlation between recessionary periods and higher unemployment. The US recession of 2020, which was the shortest recession in history, had the highest unemployment rate since the end of World War II. During the Great Recession of 08-09, unemployment spiked not only in the US, but also across the EU and indeed the world. Point being, job security is very much called into question during a recession, and this is especially worrisome considering the relatively healthy state of our current jobs market. 2022 has been characterized by record levels of job vacancies in light of the Great Resignation and the changing preferences of workers. But with the recent changes to interest rates, it's expected that employment data will start to slow. So how can you prepare for unemployment? I mean, it's not like you have a crystal ball that will tell you whether or not you're going to lose your job. Well, you could start by understanding why recessions typically bring unemployment in the first place. An OECD paper released in 2009 called The Jobs Crisis: What Are the Implications for Employment and Social Policy revealed that, quote, in the second half of 2008, a growing number of OECD and non-OECD countries experienced sharp declines in output, which quickly translated into sharp reductions in employment and hours worked, and in some cases, unprecedented increases in unemployment. The key here is sharp declines in output. In other words, companies were selling less product, making less money, and therefore didn't require or couldn't afford to keep as much staff. What causes sharp declines in output? Well, one such cause is rising interest rates, because consumer demand for goods and services falls as money becomes more expensive to borrow. And that's why we typically associate rising rates with greater risk of recession. So the question for you is whether or not your company will be severely impacted by lower lower consumer demand. Other things you could do to prepare would be ensuring that your CV is up to date, trying to increase your employability by enrolling in courses which you feel could add value to your skill set, and arguably most important, you could explore the potentiality of creating new income streams through passion projects. Ultimately, the reason why many of us fear recessions is because we know our jobs might not be as secure as they once were, and that's a problem because we're reliant on those jobs for income. In the words of Warren Buffett, if your salary is your only source of income, then you're one step away from poverty, and recessionary periods are perhaps the greatest example of times where that quote really hits home. So if you can find a way to add more income streams to your life, you'll become less reliant on your job, which will subsequently de-risk you in times of recession. Number 3, budget effectively. Unless you've been living under a rock, you'll know that inflation rates pretty much everywhere globally are hitting multi-decade highs. The US, a 40-year high of 8.6%. The Eurozone, an all-time high of 8.6% in June. And the UK, a 40-year high of 9.1%. Translation, the cost of living is out of control. Everything from our food, our energy, vehicle prices, transportation costs, medical expenses, all up by significant percentages since this time last year. A recent survey by Personal Capital indicated that entertainment, food, and vacation costs were among the top categories targeted by US consumers for spending cutbacks should inflation continue to persist. This makes sense considering US consumers are spending 41% more on entertainment, 10% more on food, 42% more on travel and vacations, and 35% more on gas than they were last year. Point being, it has arguably never been more important in your lifetime to be cost conscious. This is not the time to be spending your hard-earned cash on things you don't need. It's a time for conservatism spending-wise. Speaking of your hard-earned cash, what we've seen in the past is salaries in the Eurozone lagging behind both the US and the UK. But with the mounting pressure on employers to increase wages because of inflation, there was an expectation for an increase of 3% by the end of 2022, which will be the largest increase in a decade. However, if you're banking on your salary to keep increasing with inflation, I wouldn't be holding my breath. And this is definitely not a justification for increased spending either. As soon as companies start to feel the squeeze of lower consumer demand, costs will need to come down, and your salary is the obvious target. Bottom line, inflation uncertainty is hitting levels not seen since the 80s, and so it's best to err on the side of caution when it comes to your spending. Number 4, prioritize your emergency fund. As we mentioned, recessions are rife with uncertainty. Anything could happen. You could get a pay cut, you could lose your job, you could get an injury or become ill. Any of those things could result in a scenario whereby your income is lower than normal or is cut off completely. Unfortunately, if that happens, your bills don't automatically stop. And I don't think I need to mention how expensive the likes of energy bills are at the moment. This is where an emergency fund comes in. An emergency fund is essentially a pool of money that's set aside to cover the cost of the financial surprises that life throws our way. Idea being that should you run into financial difficulty unexpectedly, you'll at least have some cash there to support you for a period of time. But how much cash should you have in an emergency fund? The general rule of thumb that everyone talks about when it comes to emergency funds is between 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. In other words, find out how much your expenses are on average for a single month and multiply that number by between 3 and 6 to get your emergency fund target. Naturally, the size of your required emergency fund will increase as the cost of living increases. However, I'm a big believer in the idea that you yourself know best when it comes to how much cash you need to have in the bank in order to feel comfortable. You shouldn't stress about hitting some predetermined target. Instead, do your best to put away what you can and keep doing so until you feel like you've enough there to cover you in the event of an emergency. Number 5, and perhaps the most important, don't shy away from investing. Yes, the S&P 500 is down over 20% year to date and is in a bear market. And yes, the Nasdaq is down nearly 30%, but that does not mean you should automatically be cashing in your investments and hiding whatever money you have left under a mattress. One of the main reasons why we even invest in the first place is to protect our money from the effects of inflation. We know that if you let left your money in a bank account for the past 20 years, it would have lost 40% of its value, even though the numbers on the screen hadn't changed. Why? Because things naturally become more expensive over time, bit by bit, year over year. And if the money you earn today isn't earning you a return that at least keeps up with the rate of inflation, then the exact same fate is destined for you. Earlier we explained that inflation rates are in excess of 8% in many countries around the world. Tell me where the logic is in not investing to suffer a guaranteed loss of 8%. Yes, you could make the argument that the stock market has the potential to suffer larger losses than 8% in the short term, considering it's already in a bear market. But take a look at the all-time chart for the S&P 500 and tell me what you see. The market always bounces back. Bank of America analyzed the impact on investor returns of missing the best 10 days in the market in every decade, and the results are staggering. Going back as far as 1930, if you missed the best 10 days in every decade, your total return will be 28%. But had you stayed invested through thick and thin, your return will be 17,715%. Point being, investing is, always has been, and always will be a long-term game. I'm not talking about cryptocurrencies or meme stocks. I'm talking about sensible investments in productive and well-diversified assets, like low-cost index funds. Now is the time to buy the market at a discount. And no matter where the market goes in the short term, you need to stick to a consistent investment plan each and every month for decades. Sure, there's likely more pain ahead with rising interest rates hurting stock valuations and earnings, but we need to stay the course. Nobody knows where the market is going to go today, tomorrow, next month, or next year, but invest you must, because not investing is perhaps the most surefire way to lose money, and in a recession we don't want to lose money. So that's 5 ways to prepare for a recession. As with most things in finance, success lies in the basics. You already know that debt is bad. You know that you need to be conscious around spending. You know that having a plan for unexpected circumstances is the prudent thing to do. And you know that investing is sensible. These are things you know already. But what happens in turbulent times, both good and bad, is that people forget the basics. Stay calm, have a plan, and stick to it. Let me know what your thoughts are on the looming global recession. What are you doing to prepare? And do you have any other tips that I haven't mentioned in this video? Share them in the comment section below. So I really do hope you enjoyed the video here today. As always, if you did enjoy the video, please do let me know in the comment section below. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.